This nation has built all its pride on scenery of total and shameless plagiarism. For decades, they have been taught that their so-called great heritage is the fruit of some kind of uniqueness. But the reality is much more prosaic. Everything they claim is originally Russian is stolen, non-Russian material that they hastily slapped a label on. Do you think Russians have something to be proud of if behind every statement there is either a stolen blueprint or a foreign genius, whose name they preferred to erase from their memory so as not to spoil the fairy tale about their own greatness? Incredibly, even Russia's most unquestionable symbols, which citizens have been conditioned to regard with religious reverence, turn out to be nothing more than plagiarized copies of foreign originals. The very sacred objects that determine their identity were created by foreigners on a turnkey basis according to patterns brought from Europe. It is astonishing to see an entire nation regard as its own a symbol that is nothing more than a blatant act of plagiarism, adapted to its needs because of its fatal inability to create anything with its own hands. Intellectual theft is not just an episode, it is the basis of the entire history of Russia, which turned the country into a huge assembly shop of Western ideas. Their industrial breakthrough in the mid-20th century turns out, upon closer examination, to be a collection of clones copied bolt for bolt. From entire factories or rockets, to children's fairy tales, cars, and even food. While they shout about how there are no equivalents, what remains behind the scenes are thousands of appropriated patents and entire industries that were designed and built for them by foreign specialists. Russians are still living off the remnants of this borrowed industrial ingenuity from the Soviet era, having created nothing of real value since 1991. This centuries-old experience of living in a bubble of stolen illusions always ended in shameful paralysis at the first encounter with reality. Remember their main historical trauma, when Soviet tourists trained by propaganda first came to the decaying West. Then fainted in front of ordinary store shelves. They were called Papuans because the great imperialists would faint in Munich at the sight of ordinary colored toilet paper or the abundance of sausage varieties. Their entire vaunted special path was instantly depreciated. They suddenly realized that their life was just a cheap imitation. This grandiose performance of grandeur inevitably moves towards the finale, because the imitation of life cannot last forever. The history of such zombie states always ends in the same way. As soon as access to other people's ideas is cut off, the organism begins to rot alive on the fringes of civilization, leaving its citizens with nothing but a broken trough. Today, the curtain is finally falling, exposing an empty shell that tried to dictate conditions to the world, living off its own technology. Now we will turn their special path into an ordinary inventory of stolen property, after which any pride in their past will look only as an admission of their own historical weakness. Watch next. But first, subscribe to this channel and click the bell to get notifications about new videos. Don't forget to like and write comments. By doing so, you help in promoting this video. The Moscow Kremlin is the main symbol of the Russian state, the place of power of the Moscow government and a sacred object of worship for the citizens of the Russian Federation. It is regarded as the sacred, true, and homespun embodiment of everything that is quintessentially Russian. There is only one but. Why, then, was the entire Kremlin? With all its walls, towers, chambers, cathedrals, and other structures not created by Russians? How did it happen that the main symbol of the Russian state was not touched by the hand of any Russian architect? By the way, did they actually exist? And not only did they not build it themselves, but also the appearance of the Kremlin was plagiarized by the Muscovites to the smallest detail, stolen from another state. Interesting, right? Let's discuss this systematically. In our time, there are sharp disputes about the origin of the name Kremlin. Most likely, it is derived from the Turkic word Kerman, meaning fortress. This etymology agrees well with the history of the Muscovite state, which appeared on the wreckage of the Golden Horde. Since the 12th century, there has been a wooden fortress on the territory of the modern Kremlin, which was periodically destroyed as a result of enemy raids and rebuilt. In the 14th century, under Dmitry Donskoy, the Kremlin's wooden walls and towers were replaced with white stone ones, which, however, proved to be fragile and quickly began to deteriorate, eventually becoming unusable. In 1471, Prince Ivan III decided to undertake a radical reconstruction of his residence in the Kremlin. They started with the temple. Moscow builders demolished the old Dormition church and began constructing a new stone cathedral. Ivan III decided, as they would say now, to support the domestic manufacturer. Local Moscow craftsmen Mishkin and Krivtsov were invited for the construction. For 3 years they erected walls. In the spring of 1474, construction of the vault began, and the building collapsed. The Moscow prince did not tempt fate twice, but immediately, without hesitation, replaced the crooked Russian builders with foreign specialists, who then built the Kremlin. The Dormition Cathedral was successfully erected by the Italian Aristotle Fioravanti. Before that, he worked in Italy, in Milan for the Duke of Sforza. This name is one of the key ones in today's story. What do you think is the connection between Sforza Castle and the Moscow Kremlin? You will be very surprised. In Milan, Russian tourists are always speechless near this structure. The Sforza Castle, the former residence of the Dukes of Milan, is strikingly reminiscent of the Moscow Kremlin with its key architectural elements, although, on the contrary, the Italian structure was erected earlier. The Moscow Kremlin copies the Italian landmark even in small things. For example, the tops of the Kremlin walls are crowned with swallowtail-shaped battlements, just like those of the castle in Milan. The entrance to the Sforza Castle is located in the Filaret Tower. The Spasskaya Tower in Moscow became this tower's twin sister. 500 years ago they were very similar. Today the resemblance is barely discernible, and there are quite a lot of differences between them. But they appeared over time when a Gothic top with a spire was added to the Spasskaya Tower, as well as a clock, which was also changed more than once. The construction of both structures, so similar to each other, was partially influenced by the already mentioned Aristotle Fioravanti. It makes no sense to accuse the Italian architect of plagiarizing himself. The talented 60-year-old architect had enough experience and skill to carry out the most daring and diverse projects. It's just that Prince Ivan III wanted to do everything in the same way as the Duke of Milan. And Fioravanti, as well as the rest of the Italian architects, had nothing else to do. Aristotle Fioravanti completed the construction of the Dormition Cathedral in 2 years. Before that, crooked Moscow craftsmen spent 3 years only on the construction of walls that collapsed. On August 15, 1479, the Dormition Cathedral was consecrated, and it still stands to this day. The very first Italian master in Muscovy was Anton Friazin, who arrived in 1469. In Moscow, all Italians were called Friazins. His real name, unfortunately, is unknown. Under his direction, the first brick Kremlin tower, the Tainitskaya Tower, was built, followed by the corner Svoblovo-Vodovzavodnya Tower. In 1485, Marco Ruffo, an architect from Milan, arrived in Moscow. The Muscovites also called Ruffo Friazin. He worked in Muscovy for 10 years, building the state treasury courtyard and the small embankment palace. The Spasskaya, Beklemishevskaya, and Nikolskaya towers were built according to Ruffo's designs. Together with Antonio Solari, he created the Palace of Facets and also built the Borovitskaya, Spasskaya, Konstantino-Yeleninskaya, Nikolskaya, Senate and Corner Arsenal towers of the Kremlin. The Italian Aloisio de Carcano built the Great Kremlin Palace, the Troitskaya Tower and other towers as well as the Kremlin's walls and moats. Another Italian, Alevis the New, built several churches in Moscow, the most famous of which is the Archangel Cathedral. Von Friesen, a master from Italy, created the tallest building in Moscow at that time, the Ivan the Great Bell Tower. And the so-called grateful Muscovites didn't even bother to remember his real name. The entire Kremlin, the sacred symbol of Russia, was erected by Italian architects without the participation of Russians. By the way, on the territory of the Kremlin there is a Lev cannon, sneakily stolen and taken out of Ukraine by Tsarist looters, which belonged to the legendary hetman Ivan Mazepa. The cannon was cast in the city of Hlukhiv, in what is now the Sumy region, in 1705. On the breech part of the trunk there is a cast coat of arms of Mazepa, surrounded by letters denoting the initial letters of the words of his full title. The cannon is located on a decorative cast-iron carriage, made in 1835, and stands at the western facade of the arsenal to the left of the entrance arch. The carriage also contains the coat of arms of Mazepa, which was already made by Moscow craftsmen during the reign of Emperor Nicholas I. Interestingly, while the Russian Church was anathematizing Mazepa, Kremlin craftsmen, possibly Ukrainians who were working under duress, were commemorating the hetman in the heart of Moscow by placing the emblem of a hero of Ukraine on his weapon. It looks rather ironic, but if you look at the historical symbols found in the Kremlin, it turns out that the attributes of Muscovy itself are in an absolute minority here. As it happens, upon closer examination, the Muscovites have nothing worthwhile of their own, created by themselves with the possible exception of Russian literature. And even there, the people involved are often not ethnically Russian at all. Even what they consider to be inherently their own, distinctly Russian, things like bast shoes, balalaikas, pelmeni, matryoshka dolls, vodka, and the like, all of it, upon closer examination, turns out to have been stolen from other peoples. Why do I say stolen and not borrowed? Because they constantly call Russian what has never belonged to them, to the Russians. The tradition started by the crooked Russian masters Mishkin and Krivtsov, who ruined the construction of the Dormition Cathedral in 1474, has remained unchanged to this day. Muscovites have been importing from the West for centuries or stealing what they cannot do themselves. That is, absolutely everything. Even kings, even history. The list of stolen goods can be listed endlessly. And the icing on the cake is, of course, the symbol of Russia, the Moscow Kremlin, stolen from the Dukes of Milan. Perhaps this will come as a revelation to some, but absolutely everything that was produced by the USSR industry, more or less noticeable or significant, was stolen from other countries. Yes, exactly, stolen. And whatever could not be stolen was bought and passed off as their own. Goods, technologies, weapons, and even entire huge factories were borrowed from other countries. You will laugh, but even children's fairy tales were stolen. The Wizard of the Emerald City, Buratino, Dino, Hodabich, and others were plagiarized from foreign authors. Sometimes one gets the feeling that there was simply nothing of its own in the USSR. The legendary Soviet so-called ice cream was brought by Mikoyan from America. And the Soviet, again, so-called rocket and space program, which Russia likes to be so proud of, was based on captured German technologies. However, let's take a closer look at how Western technology was stolen in the USSR. Two things are particularly striking about Soviet borrowings: their enormous scale and amazing cynicism. Literally everything was copied. From huge factories, cars, tanks, planes and missiles to cameras, household appliances and children's toys. There were so many clones that it is already difficult to find at least something original among them. And all of this, often copied down to the very last screw, was given Russian names and shamelessly passed off as yet another triumph of domestic engineering. Let's start with industry. Copying does not mean that they have always stolen. What could not be stolen was bought for money. This mainly concerned large industrial facilities during the period of the so-called Stalinist industrialization. During this period, the intellectual center for industrial construction became the firm of the American architect Albert Kahn Incorporated, which had built Ford's factories in Detroit and received a package of contracts to construct more than 500 industrial facilities in the USSR, with a total value of $2 billion. That's about $250 billion in the prices of our time. A branch of Albert Kahn Incorporated was opened in Moscow, coyly named Gazproexstroy. Its head was Moritz Kahn, the brother of the head of the company. At that time, it was the largest architectural bureau in the world, acting as a coordinator between the Soviet customer and hundreds of Western companies supplying equipment and advising on the construction of individual facilities. In 1923 to 1933, 170 technical assistance agreements were concluded with the heavy industry of the USSR. 73 with German companies, 59 with American companies, 11 with French, 9 with Swedish companies, and 18 with companies from other countries. American hydraulic engineer Hugh Cooper became the chief consultant for the construction of the Dnipro HPP, for which the hydraulic turbines were purchased from General Electric and Newport News Shipbuilding. The Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works is an exact replica of the steel plant in Gary, Indiana, designed and built under the supervision of the American firm Arthur G. McKee and Company. The blast furnace for this and all other metallurgical plants in the USSR was developed by the Chicago Frame Engineering Company. The design for the Nizhny Novgorod automobile plant was carried out by Ford, while the construction design was done by the American company Austin Motor Company. The first state bearing plant in Moscow, GPZ-1, was built with the technical assistance of the Italian company RIV. The Stalingrad tractor plant, built according to Kahn's project in 1930, was originally built in the United States, and then dismantled, transported to the USSR and assembled under the supervision of American engineers. It was equipped with equipment from more than 80 American engineering companies and several German firms. Caterpillar supplied equipment for the Chelyabinsk and Kharkiv tractor plants, as well as the Rostov and Saratov combined plants. The Germans were also actively involved in industrialization. The Central Bureau of Heavy Engineering operated in Moscow as a branch of the German company Demag. Siemens Schuckertwerk AG was involved in the work and supplied modern equipment. What happened to the Soviet auto industry? The USSR borrowed the first mass-produced passenger car from the American auto industry. Gaz A is a licensed copy of the American Ford A. The USSR bought equipment and documents for production from an American company in 1929, and 2 years later the production of Ford A was stopped. A year later, in 1932, the first Gaz A cars were produced. The next Soviet experimental passenger car, the Leningrad one, was an almost exact copy of the Buick car 3290. The Krasny Pudolovets plant, which had previously produced Fordson tractors, manufactured 6 L1 vehicles in 1933. A significant part of the cars could not reach Moscow under their own power without serious breakdowns. As a result, Krasny Pudolovets was redirected to the production of tractors and tanks, while further development of the L1 was transferred to the Moscow ZIS plant. The GAZ M1 in turn was designed based on the Ford Model B, specifically the 1934 Model 40A, for which the American side provided GAZ with the documentation under the terms of the agreement. In the course of adapting the model to Soviet operating conditions, the car was partially redesigned by Soviet specialists. The first Soviet serial subcompact car was to be the Kim 10, which was based on the British Ford Prefect. In the United States, the dies were manufactured and the body drawings were developed based on the designs of a Soviet artist and designer. In 1940, the plant began production of this model. However, the implementation of the ambitious plan of the country's leadership to provide the majority of citizens with personal cars was prevented by the Second World War. But this war only encouraged copying and cloning. After World War II, 2,885 factories, 96 power plants, 340,000 machine tools, and 200,000 electric motors were taken from Germany to the USSR alone. About 1,000 factories were transported to the USSR from Manchuria and Korea. In just 1 year, 4,389 enterprises from Germany, Austria, Hungary, and other European countries were dismantled and taken out. As a result, the Moskvich 400 appeared in the USSR, a precise copy of the Opel Kadett K38, which was produced in Germany from 1937 to 1940 at Opel's German branch, owned by the American corporation General Motors. Most of the equipment needed to produce the car was removed from the Opel plant in Russelsheim, which was located in the American occupation zone, and installed in the USSR. Later, the concept of copying automobiles changed somewhat, and it was embodied in the first post-war Soviet luxury passenger car, the ZIS 110. In appearance, down to the smallest details, the ZIS 110 resembled the Packard 180 with a touring sedan body, the final pre-war model from 1942. At the same time, the chassis of the ZIS 110 was an original development. The American company could hardly have been pleased with such a creative development of its ideas in the design of a Soviet automobile. However, there were no complaints from it in those years. Moreover, the production of large packages stopped after the war. Almost all Soviet cars borrowed a lot from foreign analogs, although they had some differences. These included the ZAZ 965, whose prototype was the Fiat 600, the ZAZ 966, which copied the design of the German compact car NSU Prinz 5, and the Moskvich 2141, a front-wheel drive hatchback based on the body of the Franco-American Simca 1308, produced by Chrysler's European division, and powered by the UZM engine, which was already outdated by that time from the Ufa automotive engine plant. A notable exception was the famous Ziguli Vaz 2101. They were a fully licensed version of the Italian Fiat 124. Under the agreement of the Soviet foreign trade with Fiat, the Italians made the Volga automobile plant in Tolyatti with a full production cycle. The concern was entrusted with the technological equipment of the plant and the training of specialists. The Vaz 2103 model was developed jointly with the Italian company Fiat, based on the Fiat 124 and Fiat 125 models. Later, based on the Vaz 2103, the 21031 project was developed, which was subsequently renamed the Vaz 2106. And this is the Ural, a development of the M72 military motorcycle, a Soviet heavy motorcycle that was a complete copy of the German BMW R71, the BMW 750. It began to be made even before the war. First, the Soviets sent Serdyukov for an internship at BMW, and, apparently, there was a theft of documentation. He later became the head of the Design Bureau for Heavy Motorcycle Construction. Then the USSR anonymously purchased 5 motorcycles in Sweden and in 1941, began production of a so-called domestic motorcycle under the M72 brand at the Moscow motorcycle plant. Let me digress from the topic for a moment. At the beginning, I said that even many children's fairy tales in the Soviet Union were stolen from foreign authors. The Wizard of the Emerald City, Buratino, Dino, Old Man Kotovich, Dr. Abelet, and others. What was the situation with plagiarism of military equipment in the USSR? Exactly the same as with plagiarism of everything else. The Soviet T-26 light tank was a copy of the popular export British Vickers MKE tank. Purchased in the United States along with a package of design documentation, the M1928 Christie tank became a Soviet BT-2 tank after adaptation. Interestingly, the legendary Soviet T-34 tank appeared as a result of the development of the ideas of the American designer Christie and used his unique suspension. In the field of small arms, there are also more than enough borrowings. The Soviet TT pistol, both externally and structurally, is very similar to the Browning 1903, adapted to a cartridge of a different caliber. Until recently, disputes about authorship were caused by a difference in the mechanics of locking the shutter. But not so long ago, a rare sample of Browning was found in the collection of the Tula Arms Factory, from which it seems the TT was copied. Even before the war with Finland in 1934, the Soviet Army received the PPD submachine gun. And it would all be fine, except that it looks almost exactly like the Finnish Suomi submachine gun, which was introduced in 1931. The same can be said about many other Soviet models of small arms. Disputes about the authorship of the Kalashnikov assault rifle and the intellectual contribution of Hugo Schmeisser to its design still do not subside. And what was happening in the space industry? The most valuable prize captured by the USSR during the war with Germany turned out to be the V-2 rockets. To study the German rocket program, the so-called Nordhausen Institute was established on the basis of 3 V-2 assembly plants: the Rabe Institute, the Montagne engine plant, and a test facility in Germany. Gaidakov became its director, Korolyov became its chief engineer, and Glushko headed the department for the study of V-2 engines. From 1945 to 1947, Soviet specialists collected all available data on the production of German rockets in Germany. And there was something to collect. Design documentation, finished samples, production equipment and tooling, methods for calculating heat transfer, calculating thermodynamics and mixture formation in the chamber, gas dynamics, gas leakage from the nozzle, and so on. It took Soviet specialists several years to copy the V-2. The low production culture and the lack of the necessary domestic components had an effect. The German rocket used 87 grades and specifications of steel, as well as 59 non-ferrous metals. In its domestic clone R1, there were 32 and 21 respectively. Of course, this would not have been possible without the assistance of German specialists. All those who did not get to the Americans were gathered in Nordhausen. In late October 1946, German specialists working in the production units of the Nordhausen Institute were unexpectedly awakened by Soviet soldiers, who told them to gather their necessary belongings and, together with their families, board the prepared railway cars for transportation to the USSR. At first, they were housed in sanatoriums near Moscow, in Menino, Valentinovka, and on the Klyazma River, and then an entire small town was built for them on Gorodomlya Island in the middle of Lake Seliger. The Soviet Germans gave the world technical solutions that have now become classics of rocketry. Detachable head parts, carrier tanks, intermediate bottoms, hot pressurization of fuel tanks, flat injector heads of engines, and so on. They also developed designs for ballistic missiles with ranges of 600, 800, 2,500, and 3,000 kilometers, extending toward intercontinental range. Essentially, the entire family of R-7 rockets, Vostok, Voskhod, Soyuz, and others on which Russia still launches spacecraft into orbit today, is a substantial development of the solutions and ideas of German specialists incorporated into the V-2. What was happening in aviation? On the eve of the Second World War, out of the 4 main aircraft engine factories of the USSR, only one produced Soviet engines designed by Mikulin, and the rest produced licensed imported ones. These were various modifications of American Wright Cyclone engines and French Hispano-Suiza and Gnome-Rhone engines. However, the Americans did not want to sell something to the Soviets. For example, the most advanced heavy bomber of the 1943 to 1947 period, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, incorporated many technical solutions that were implemented for the first time in the history of global aircraft manufacturing. During combat sorties during Operation Matterhorn, several American B-29s were damaged and landed on Soviet territory. One B-29 crashed, the other 3 made an emergency landing. For Stalin, the arrival of the B-29 on Soviet soil was a real gift, so Stalin ordered aircraft designer Tupolev to make an exact copy of the B-29, bolt for bolt, within 2 years. In general, he succeeded, although many details in the USSR could not be repeated. The copy was called Tu-4. By the way, the first Soviet atomic bomb, RDS-1, modeled after the American Fat Man, was dropped from a Tu-4. That is, one copy dropped another one. And here's some fresh information for you. Russia's first and only post-Soviet passenger airliner, the Superjet, is not exactly a Russian aircraft. About 70% of its components, including the most critical ones, are imported components. Avionics is made by the French Thales and the American Hamilton Sundstrand. The SAM-146 engines were produced by Powerjet, a Russian-French joint venture established by NPO Saturn and the French company Snecma. The oxygen system, interior, and doors were supplied by the American company B Aerospace. These are major details. And auxiliary power plants, hydraulics, fuel system, brakes and other little things are also made from imported components or purchased directly abroad. And now, probably the most interesting part for many, what was the situation with the copying of household appliances? It would never have occurred to me that my grandmother's old vacuum cleaner and my grandfather's electric razor were copies of foreign-made ones. For example, the Agile electric shaver is almost a complete copy of the Philishave razor. The same vacuum cleaner could be seen by older people at the exhibition, Soviet Design 1950 to 1970. Apparently, the organizers of the exhibition believed that it was Soviet design. In fact, it turned out to be a Dutch vacuum cleaner sold under the Utonia brand in the US and Canada, and as Remoco in the UK, and as Eries in other European countries. The vacuum cleaner with the striking name Moscow turned out to be just as unoriginal. The Moskva vacuum cleaner is almost a complete copy of the American Lewitt Model 40 vacuum cleaner. Even the ZIS Moscow refrigerator, produced in 1953 and standing in my grandmother's kitchen, turned out to be a copy of an American pre-war model. Interestingly, when it came to cameras, the USSR did not bother at all. Almost all of them are unlicensed copies of Western cameras. For example, the Zorky 10 and its prototype, the Ricoh Auto 35. The Fed Micron and the Konica I. And the Fed Micron 2 and once again a Konica camera, this time the full-frame S35. In general, the Konica brand was loved in the USSR in a rather strange way because its first autofocus camera, the Konica S35AF, was copied at Bellomo under the name Elikon Autofocus. In addition, Bellomo also attempted to copy the highly original compact rangefinder camera, the Olympus XA, simply naming the copy the Elikon. Now let's look at how things were with consumer electronics. Here is the Electronics 501 video reel-to-reel videotape recorder, manufactured in 1974, for recording black and white images in the European television standard, along with their sound from the Electronics 841 television camera. And this is the Sony DV3400 videotape recorder from 1969. Curiously, even the nameplate with the brand name was copied in the USSR. In 1984, mass production began of the first Soviet VHS format videotape recorder, the Electronica VM-12. It turned out to be remarkably similar to the Japanese Panasonic NV-2000, which had been released back in 1975. The next videotape recorder model is the Electronica VMC-8220, introduced in 1987. It turns out that this is an almost exact copy of the Samsung VX-8220 videotape recorder. They even tried to repeat the appearance. There was not enough imagination for their own design. A little about children's toys. The popular Electronica IM-02 Noo Pagodi electronic game, which was produced starting in 1984, turned out to be an unofficial clone of the Japanese Nintendo EG-26 egg from the 1981 Nintendo Game & Watch series. The Electronica 2401 Mickey Mouse turned out to be a clone of the Nintendo MC-25 Mickey Mouse. The 1987 Electronica IM-03C Mysteries turned out to be a clone of the 1981 Nintendo OS-22 Octopus, and so on. In 1985, the Solnechnogorsk electromechanical plant released a toy called Electronica IM-11 Lunocode. It is a clone of the Big Track electronic toy, a programmable vehicle developed and released by the American company Milton Bradley back in 1979. And this is a very rare toy, the Electronica IM-12, with interchangeable cartridges and a transmissive display. It turned out to be a copy of the Nintendo CJ93 Donkey Kong JA from the Panorama Screen series, released in 1983. The Electronica IM-26, with interchangeable screens in the form of cartridges, was produced starting in late 1988. The set included 2 upper parts with screens and 1 lower part. Back in 1983, the company Bandai released the DG CAS, from which the idea of interchangeable cartridges was borrowed. Electronica IM-27 Space Adventures, 1990. The experimental series of games in the form of binoculars with a stereoscopic image is completely copied from Planet Xeon from Tomy, which released a whole series of similar games called Tomatronic 3D in 1983. Electronica IM-46 Calculator and Music Synthesizer, released in 1994. And this is the Casio VL-Tone VL1, which was produced about a decade and a half earlier, in 1980. In the Soviet Union, they also copied more serious equipment. The Soviet home computer Bake was an equivalent of the ZX Spectrum, produced by the English company Sinclair, while the Soviet Agate was a copy of the Apple II in a garish, tacky design. In modern Russia, they have largely stopped copying other people's products, preferring not to bother with manufacturing, but instead to buy finished products or limit themselves to screwdriver assembly. Nevertheless, the painful craving to appropriate other people's laurels has not gone away. The list of clones can be continued almost indefinitely. It will include irons, military equipment, industrial machinery, and electronics, the lion's share of what was considered indigenous and homegrown in Russia. The sheer scale of these borrowings is discouraging and even frightening, as is the unshakable conviction of the overwhelming majority of the population that everything Soviet is their own, homegrown, and, moreover, excellent, that they are ahead of the rest of the world. Although the last 100 years have been weaving in the rearguard of world technical thought. But the main thing in this story is different. Counterfeits and licensed copies were always released late. Some were a couple of years late and some were a decade and a half. At the same time, most Soviet fakes, despite the external resemblance to the prototype, turned out to be much worse than the original. There were several reasons for this. Attempts by Moscow's self-taught inventors to cut production costs, a lack of the necessary materials or manufacturing equipment, as well as a low level of manufacturing culture, carelessness, poorly trained specialists, last-minute rushes to meet deadlines, and other consequences of unprofessional management. Progress is constantly accelerating, and if in the Stone Age nothing changed at all for several centuries, now there are huge shifts in technology every year. Spending a couple of years copying a computer or smartphone means getting a hopelessly outdated and practically useless device as a result. The price of an entrance ticket to the world of high technology is growing. To copy a modern processor, you first need to copy a factory with the appropriate process technology. And in order to copy a factory, you need to copy the entire machine building industry. Enormous investments in research and production require enormous markets to recoup their costs. Even if we imagine that, through a heroic exertion of effort and several years behind schedule, Russians somehow managed to build an entire industry and learn to manufacture an equivalent of an imported high-tech product, only with somewhat inferior quality. Who will buy it? Locked in an economic ghetto and impoverished Russians? It won't be possible to foist an outdated, low-quality product on anyone else, even without any sanctions. And without large-scale production and sales, all the costs will have to be borne by each individual unit, making the product literally worth its weight in gold. Of course, it can be subsidized until the money in the reserves runs out, and it runs out and runs out very quickly. And then either you will have to save up for it for half your life, or the good old Soviet-style shortage will inevitably return with empty shelves, long queues, and connections. Miracles happen, you just have to really want to. For example, Russians dreamed of resurrecting the Soviet Union. And there you have it. The dream came true, the miracle happened. The people of the country that cannot be understood by reason fail to consider that something that has risen from the dead is usually called a zombie, and as horror movies warn us, burying it again will be practically impossible. And so the long-suffering people of Muscovy are in for quite a shock as they tumble head over heels in a time machine back into their dark and backward past. They will have to realize how tightly Russia has been closely integrated into world processes. And it turns out that it isn't a separate planet after all, but a small pus-filled abscess on the body of the world. And the world will take care to isolate itself from this dangerous infection, just as it isolated itself from the USSR in almost all the years of its existence. If anyone has forgotten how it was, then I will remind you now. For example, what do any of us associate with the word tourism? Of course, first of all, with rest, adventure, and impressions. It would seem that the desire to explore other worlds, to be able to leave the boundaries of one's home, is one of the most natural ancient human needs. As well as the need for this very house, where you always want to return. But it wasn't that simple. In the USSR, the more natural a person's need was, the more restrictions it received. But on the other hand, a resident of the Soviet Union abroad had no less impressions than Alice in Wonderland. Do you remember the scenes from Gaidai's famous film The Diamond Arm, when Semyon Gorbunkov is about to set off on his first trip abroad? How nervous his wife was as she answered the reporter on her husband's behalf. The subtext is unmistakable. She'd better not let Semyon say anything he shouldn't, or his first trip might turn out to be his last. What could an ill-timed word cost a Soviet tourist? What was this Soviet tourist like? And most importantly, what baffled Soviet tourists in Europe? It is important for all Russians to be reminded of this today, because their near future will be about the same as that of the inhabitants of the Soviet Union. Let's take a closer look. It's going to be a pretty interesting episode. A year 1956. A large group of leading Soviet writers and poets, including such luminaries as Konstantin Postovsky, Rasul Gamzatov, and Danil Granin, traveled abroad. The program of the trip included visits to cities such as Paris, Rome, and Athens. Nothing special for a modern person. However, back then, in the late 1950s, just as in the preceding 40s and 30s, as well as in the subsequent 60s, 70s, and even 80s, these words were perceived quite differently, as if someone had announced that the aforementioned people had left the planet. Here's what Daniil Granin, a committed communist and recipient of the USSR State Prize and 2 Orders of Lenin, recalled about the trip. When we told our family what we saw, they didn't believe us. We tried to justify the striking differences and defend our way of life. It was difficult to admit our living standards were below Europe's. We had to somehow protect our consciousness because it turned out that we were idiots. What struck even his propaganda-hardened consciousness? Perhaps this trip was one of the starting points for a change in mindset. Something abroad affected all Soviet tourists in the same way, making them forget the enviable, so to speak, pleasure of carrying a duplicate of a priceless treasure, the Soviet passport, in their trouser pockets. Residents of abroad, called the visitors Papuans, so far from civilization were the Soviet guests. They always went in groups, supervised by escorts. They were amazed by everything and rushed to buy the wonders of Western industry. Girls bought nightgowns, thinking they were fancy sundresses, and proudly wore them everywhere. There was none of the promised, so to speak, poverty, slums, or cries of the exploited masses. None of that horror story about a capitalist swamp unfit for life, the decaying West, inhabited by bourgeoisie, passed down from old to young. In short, the bourgeoisie scared generations of Soviet children. In their minds, it became closely associated with boogeyman. They were depicted on propaganda posters as grotesquely obese monsters, hungrily preying on the proletariat's bright future. And here they are, bourgeois, calm, smiling, well-groomed people. It's hard to know how to react, rejoice, or feel disheartened. For us, all this was a revelation, Granin recalls. We still felt pretty comfortable in Bulgaria, but when we reached Paris, and especially Rome and Athens, we were completely shocked. We looked at each other dumbfounded and could not understand where the rotten West was, where man is a wolf to man. We came to see the truth and suffered, confused and lost, trying to keep a straight face. How eagerly we searched for all sorts of scandals. God, what a joy it was when we saw some beggar. "Where are your slums?" we asked. Because we were looking for what was the advantage of our system, about which we were told endlessly at home. But we could not find them. There was no resentment toward the defeated yet, it came later when we arrived in Germany. So far, it has been the confusion of the Soviet people, who were suddenly released from their cage. Alish Adamovich told me how he was once walking through a village when a dog tied to a fence started lunging at him and barking. And suddenly the rope broke. He stopped and the dog got scared and ran back to its kennel. A rope gave her courage. So it is with us. When we got abroad, the rope broke and we ran to our kennel to make sure we weren't doing so bad. Some idiots in our delegation criticized 2 old men singing Neapolitan songs on Capri, even though we enjoyed listening to them. "Why are you listening to them? Our singers sing better." We replied that singers might be better, but these old men are not singers at all. But our men are better lovers than the Italians, they insisted. They had to hold on to something. These sudden wonders were heavily obscured by propaganda from the group supervisors. They claimed his benefits weren't for ordinary people. Yet the abundance and lack of queues and shops open to everyone were stunning. The word deficit in the rich Soviet Union was probably uttered no less often than Lenin and the party. That is precisely why the travel notes of the Soviet elite, poets, writers, and artists, so often contain vivid descriptions of the West's gastronomic abundance, as well as its comfortable, beautiful, and, amazingly, affordable clothing. In their supposedly equal country, such clothes were available only at the notorious hard currency stores called Beryaska. Needless to say, it was simply impossible for an ordinary citizen to get into this Beryaska. And they couldn't afford it, it's like going abroad. Soviet clothes were a mockery of the very concept of fashion and a mockery of the centuries of human clothing civilization. In the 70s and 80s, there was such a joke. A foreigner in a Moscow department store sees an unprecedented queue and wonders what they can sell. He was answered, Today the Yugoslav boots were thrown away. The word thrown away usually meant that suddenly some scarce product appeared on sale. A foreigner looks at the boot and says, "Yeah, we throw these away too." A locust-like frenzy descended on hotels with buffets, recalls the legendary ballerina Maya Plisitskaya, whose memoirs are as brilliant as her leaps. They describe the unsightly side of the touring life of the Soviet artist with peremptory honesty. Within minutes, everything was eaten and drunk down to the last drop. Those who were late or overslept would angrily confront the staff, grab them by the lapels, demand more, and appeal to their conscience. Shame and disgrace. I am describing what I myself witnessed. My own Bolshoi theater, but the same thing happened with other touring groups. And here is another evidence of the era. Russian poet and writer Vladimir Voinovich emigrated to the United States in 1980 to escape persecution by the KGB. Of course, at first, his Soviet ideas about reality contrasted sharply with reality. While riding in a taxi, he asked the American driver what seemed to him a perfectly reasonable question. "Do you get meat with ration cards, or do you get it through connections?" He was very surprised when the equally surprised driver replied that he bought meat, like all other food at any supermarket. "Now imagine," the writer said, "that there is no meat, canned food, sausage, or frankfurters in your supermarket, the next one, or even in the neighboring city." "Yes," the driver replied. "I've heard Russians have trouble getting meat, but after all, you can always eat chicken." The writer, whose wonderful sense of humor, like that of many people in the Soviet Union, made up for the lack of things to laugh about, recalls, "My wife and I laughed a lot because the taxi driver had almost repeated a remark attributed to the French Queen Marie Antoinette. Why is the people rioting if they have no bread, let them eat cake?" The Soviet people were misunderstood globally. And how was it possible to understand this? My native land is vast, with its many forests, fields, and rivers. I know of no other country where a person breathes so freely, goes the stirring patriotic song from 1939 by Dostoevsky and Lebedev Kumach about the Soviet homeland. How can you not agree with this? Especially from today's perspective, these words read quite differently, with almost every line carrying a bitter irony. That's right, a Soviet citizen for many years really did not know another such country, and none at all, because no one was going to let him out of this country. At best, these very forests, fields, and rivers were offered, but for special merits. For 70 years, the motherland carefully protected her children from the temptation to go outside by surrounding them with barbed wire and the hopelessness of bureaucratic labyrinths. But here's the catch. No matter how hard Soviet mythmakers tried to convince ordinary people that they lived in a fairy tale, the word abroad was secretly associated with fairy tales, and the urge to travel to far-off lands was chronic. Unable to overcome man's natural attraction to other worlds, everything was done to develop complete ignorance of them. And what to do? After all the power of this superpower rested on medieval folk obscurantism. The motherland's borders are sacred, anything beyond is sinful. Interestingly, the Soviet person, raised for generations amid spy mania, taught to suspect a secret agent in anyone wearing dark glasses, and tormented by constant fear and humiliation, nevertheless believed that there was something even more terrifying. The people could not be allowed to see the truth, yet they were waking up, and quite quickly. By the way, unlike today's times, today's Russians do not even think of waking up. As early as 1934, the Soviet Criminal Code introduced the new concept of treason against the motherland, which also included fleeing abroad. This opens up countless opportunities for keeping the people in patriotic spirits. Refusing the honor of being a citizen of the Soviet Union was punishable by execution and confiscation of all property. Remarkably, despite the extremely strict selection of candidates for foreign trips, severe punishments, and the extremely dangerous, almost doomed undertaking of escape, the number of defectors, those who refused to return home after legal trips abroad, more than doubled in the early 30s. According to a report by the Central Control Commission dated June 5, 1930, 277 people failed to return home, 34 of whom were apparently ardent communists. And now even more shocking facts. A year 1945. The Soviet people, through inhuman efforts, won the so-called Great Patriotic War. Now that their loyalty to the motherland and Stalin has been proven, surely life would finally get better. This reflects the average citizen's propaganda brainwashed thinking. But for a reasonable person, his future was, if not clear, then at least predictable. People still vividly remembered forced collectivization, the Great Terror, Stalin's purges, the famine in Ukraine, the siege of Leningrad, and the hopeless poverty of so-called peacetime. The long-awaited day meant the soldiers' happy return home. However, the truth shocks those accustomed to seeing those days through the lens of old newsreels and photographs showing tearful embraces and gray hair at the temples. Of course, it was, but ruthless documentary evidence suggests that not all those who fought accepted the opportunity to return with joy. Many chose to stay even in the country of a fierce enemy. In the first post-war months, Germany no longer kept any records of citizens. The new German administration did not yet exist, while the Soviet troops were undergoing reorganization amid the confusion of the celebrations. There is no exact information about how many Red Army soldiers remained in Europe after the war. According to indirect evidence and research by military historian Grigory Krivoshein, as of July 1, 1945, NKVD reports listed 212,400 servicemen as missing, left behind by their trains, or deserters. Even earlier, in September 1944, Zubov, deputy head of a department of the USSR NKVD's Anti-Banditry Directorate, prepared a report for the leadership on the number of deserters from the Red Army during the 3 years of the Great Patriotic War. At that point, how many do you think they counted? 1,210,224 people. The exiled émigré Vladimir Voinovich recounted, "Right across from us lives Nastia, a former collective farm worker from near Kharkiv. As a young girl during the war, the Germans took her to Germany. After the war, she did not return home. She had a hard time here, but she dared not return home. Back to the collective farm, where she worked from dawn till dusk and went hungry. Where her father was taken away forever, for reasons unknown, and to an unknown place. And her fate after returning would have been highly uncertain." Stalin did not like people who had been abroad, even if not of their own free will. He did not like not only those who fought against the Soviet army or did something else hostile. Stalin did not like all people who saw Western life and could compare it with Soviet life. Returning to the topic of closed borders, this is not the first time such isolation has been observed in the history of Russia. The terrifying 16th century, in terms of freedom of movement, was also characterized by completely closed state borders. Ivan the Terrible took this measure not only to keep outsiders from entering the country, but also to prevent his own people from being tempted to see foreign lands. And as you know, Stalin felt special sympathy for Ivan the Terrible and in some way correlated himself with him. He considered the closure of borders to be especially successful wisdom of the bloody Ivan. Then why not repeat history? Russia highly values its traditions. So, in order to reduce thoughts about the size and capabilities of the globe in the Soviet head to minimal indicators, the propaganda machine created for him an amazing system of travel restrictions. And its name is Phantasmagoria. From the late 1920s onward, only outstanding workers and loyalists could afford to travel, and only within the USSR. They could, but under strict supervision, also fulfilling the task of their native party. In the late 20s and early 30s, the Soviet authorities purposefully put the tourist movement in public service. At least some variety in the gray Soviet everyday life. Following orders from above, tourists traveling across the Soviet Union mapped the terrain, searched for mineral deposits, learned wilderness survival skills, and spread the good word about the party through socially useful work. For example, propaganda evenings and concerts were organized in remote villages. This highlights the fanaticism of potential tourist citizens. Of course, a country like the USSR could not afford complete isolation from the world. That is why the Foreign Travel Commission had already been operating since September 1927. But this did not make it easier for anyone because these trips were only working and only as part of delegations. Writers, artists, scientists and other elite, who made up the main traveling contingent, underwent the strictest ideological selection on the basis of the so-called reliability. In fact, what can be called outbound international tourism appeared in the USSR only in 1955. This was due to the death of Stalin and the détente of international relations. Tourism finally began to be considered as an economically profitable area, but this did not simplify the process of leaving. There is still a whole era before that. The lucky ones were checked at different levels from the trade union to the party. A potential tourist had to pass an exam. For example, if someone was going to East Germany, they had to know the chairman of the Communist Party of Germany and what he had said in his speech at the latest party congress. A tourist had to know CPSU Congress materials and the history of the workers' movement. All members of the traveling group in the 70s were obliged to familiarize themselves with the contents of the brochure entitled The USSR, 100 Questions and Answers. This was supposed to save the Soviet soul in contact with demonic foreigners, that is, with spies. He talked to me like a brother about the treacherous West. Vysotsky mocked this brainwashing in his song Instructions Before Traveling Abroad. The main reason for refusal to leave was compromising materials. Anything could fall into this category. An ill-timed Brezhnev anecdote, for example. It is very bad if you have relatives abroad because you had someone to run to. By the way, I wonder if the inhabitants of the country have thought that absolutely no one tried to flee from Western countries to their magical lands. You could not be allowed to leave the country even if you were just divorced. If you divorce your wife, then you will betray your homeland. Of course, the human factor also played an important role. Vigilant colleagues and acquaintances could convey important information about you. There were also unspoken agreements. For example, the head of the International Tourism Bureau was reprimanded by the Central Committee for letting a cross-eyed man leave the country. This is a bad reputation for the country. In the Soviet Union, no one is cross-eyed or lame. An essential stage in preparing for a trip abroad was the formation of a complexly structured group. In 1980, for example, it was organized as follows. From among the tourists who had to be CPSU members and have experience in propaganda work, an ideological group of 4 to 6 people was selected. A group leader, an assistant group leader, and a treasurer were elected. A souvenir group was also elected, whose duties included the purchase of Soviet souvenirs, which were given to foreigners or exchanged for their souvenirs. The shepherds tried not to leave their flock for even a second, making sure that all group members slept in the designated place, did not talk to foreigners, did not read foreign newspapers, and above all, did not start romances. Often, tourists only guessed who from their group was a representative of the KGB. Any of the misdeeds meant that you would never leave the borders of the motherland again. This is at best. They were taught that any person abroad who wanted to get in touch, any smiling girl is most likely a provocation. And in order not to weaken the influence of the Soviet information field for a minute, serious work was carried out. For example, in 1978, a group of Soviet tourists taking a cruise around Europe aboard the ship Karelia was forced to listen to the entire contents of Leonid Brezhnev's book, Virgin Lands, throughout the trip. This is only a small fraction of the humiliations to which those who want to see the world were subjected. No wonder that many tourists, after going through the hell of inspections, lost their heads when confronted with the freedom abroad, including sexual one. In their minds, accustomed to severe restrictions, such ordinary human freedom was confused with lawlessness. Numerous stories about the atrocities committed by Soviet citizens abroad originate here. Hardened by the purges like salt, as Mandelstam put it, the chosen ones often went off the rails. They partied like there was no tomorrow. Russo turismo oblique morale. Everyone remembers this phrase from the Diamond Arm, but not everyone knows what a subtle joke was hidden behind it. Night drunkenness and brawls are a common occurrence in the hotels where these Russian tourists stayed. Free people produce more material values than unfree people. Actually, this is what Karl Marx thought. But this was completely forgotten in socialist society. As a result, the words jeans, tape recorder, Coca-Cola made a much greater impression on a member of this society than freedom, equality, and fraternity. At least our singers are better, they consoled themselves buying foreign clothes and electronics. In his memoirs, Vladimir Voinovich tells a hilarious story about an Orthodox Soviet woman who, on her first trip to the West, specifically Munich, walked into an ordinary German store. While she was looking at numerous varieties of cheese and sausages, she somehow still held on, but when she saw the types of toilet paper available in the assortment, white, pink, flowered, polka dot and checked, she lost consciousness. But it wasn't just material goods that impressed Soviet visitors. There was something stronger, namely, the strongest myth of ideology was destroyed. It turns out that there was another point of view on all historical and current events, and it did not present the Soviet Union in the best light. For example, in 1983, a Soviet pilot mistakenly shot down a South Korean Boeing 747. At that time, by an unfortunate coincidence, the Bolshoi Drama Theater arrived in Japan from the Soviet Union on tour from Moscow. Though innocent, the theater artists fully felt the Soviet Union's attitude. As always, the Soviet version differed from that of the world's media. At first, amid the emotions, it insisted it was right, claiming the plane had deliberately entered Soviet airspace. Later, it became clear a monstrous misunderstanding, amplified by the Cold War atmosphere, had occurred. But then ordinary citizens could only follow the party's opinion. As Andropov said, "Of course we feel sorry for the people, but our air defense acted correctly, so that's how it is." And how amazed the theater artists were when they heard the definition of their friendliest country in the world as an evil empire. The unity of the Soviet people and its cohesion around one party in government demanded from me a complete denial of our guilt in the death of the unfortunate passengers. But the treacherous Hamlet-like doubt of a confused mind made people blame themselves. The team has different opinions on this matter. But the poster "You Killed Our Family" made a strong impression on everyone, wrote actor Vladimir Receptor. Of course, factors such as beautiful clothes and quality food, no queues and luxurious toilet paper are not the main factors in the magical transformation from tourist to refugee. And even today, seemingly far more prosperous Russia loses a huge number of its people every year. Although there is less and less of this prosperity today. Thanks to Putin's policies that triggered unprecedented sanctions, Russia is moving forward by leaps and bounds in the USSR, and into a much worse version of the Soviet Union. And it is not only ordinary citizens who are fleeing, but also the best progressive minds. Instead of an afterword. On June 16, 1961 in Paris, one of the world's most brilliant ballet dancers, Soviet citizen and leading dancer of the Kirov Theater at the time, Rudolf Nureyev, made his famous leap to freedom. "I want to be free," he told French reporters after miraculously escaped at the last second from the hands of KGB officers who wanted to forcibly return him to his homeland. He entered complete obscurity, having neither money nor clothes, and there, in the USSR, his mother and sisters remained. And yet he did it because freedom, the primary need of a full-fledged person, is the biggest deficit in that fabulous Soviet country. And as the present day shows, freedom is already in extremely short supply in the Russian Federation, this USSR 2.0, hurtling toward an abyss of obscurantism and hatred of humanity.